Throughout history, betrayal between lovers was never a private matter. It was a crime against order, bloodline, and divine authority. When women were accused of infidelity, justice did not come quietly. It came with fire, stone, rope, and blade. Societies across continents forged punishments so extreme they became instruments of fear, warnings carved into the public memory. These were not moments of rage. They were systems of control, sanctioned by kings, priests, and law. This is the legacy of punishment when love became treason. Drowned in the sack in medieval Germany. In the 13th to 16th centuries, across the Holy Roman Empire, one of the most chilling punishments inflicted on women accused of adultery was sack drowning, or Sackung. This form of execution was codified in various local legal texts and practiced in parts of southern Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. The punishment was not carried out in secret, nor was it a rare sentence. It was a public spectacle, a legal ritual, and a moral warning. The Saxenspiegel, a 13th century German law code compiled by Eike von Repgau, described the crime of female adultery as a direct offence against the husband's honour and his household. While men accused of adultery were often fined or humiliated, women were subjected to deadly physical punishment. According to the Carolina, the 1532 Criminal Code issued under Emperor Charles V, a woman who breaks the marriage bond through adultery may be executed by drowning in accordance with local custom. The condemned woman would be bound and sewn into a weighted sack, often with stones or even live animals like dogs or cats, and cast into a nearby river. In places like Nuremberg and Augsburg, the punishment was carried out with grim ceremony. Officials and townspeople watched as the woman struggled against the suffocating darkness of the sack, unable to scream, flail, or plead. Drowning in this way was slow, disorienting, and final. The body was usually left to float downstream as a warning to others. Drowning was often considered less bloody and therefore more appropriate for women. Yet the ritualized nature of sack drowning reveals that it was anything but merciful. The intent was to strip the condemned of identity, voice, and dignity. Adulterous women were seen as contaminating the moral and social fabric, and so they were disposed of like waste beneath the water in silence. This punishment illustrates the gendered cruelty of medieval justice. The woman was not only executed, but erased, hidden from view, denied burial, and silenced in both life and death. Burned alive in the town square, Europe's public justice. In late medieval and early modern Europe, public executions by fire were not just punitive. They were deeply theatrical acts of state power, moral cleansing, and social discipline. For women accused of adultery, especially when paired with charges like witchcraft, heresy, or unchaste living, burning alive became one of the most brutal methods of punishment. The flame, in the eyes of the authorities, was a purifier, and the woman's body, once accused of defying moral expectations, was deemed fit only for elimination. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cities across France, the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Spain documented burnings of women found guilty of marital betrayal. In 1431, for instance, court records from Rouen, France, show that women could be sentenced to death by fire for what was often vaguely termed immoral conduct. Though adultery alone was not always enough to justify burning, it was frequently used as an aggravating factor when authorities sought to justify extreme measures. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, a legal and theological manual used in witch trials, explicitly linked women's moral transgressions to spiritual decay. If a woman was known to have strayed from her husband, especially if she did so openly, or with a man of lower class, she could easily be painted as a danger to the moral order. Accusations escalated quickly. A woman once called adulteress might be labelled a seductress, a heretic, or even a witch. And for such women, fire was the sentence. Executions took place in the town square, often on market days. The woman would be dressed in a simple garment, tied to a wooden stake and surrounded by bundles of dry wood. Crowds assembled not just to witness, but to absorb the lesson. A woman's personal conduct was seen as belonging to her husband and her community, not to herself. Clerics delivered sermons. Town criers read the charges aloud. And then the fire was lit. Burning alive was a prolonged, horrifying death. Flames first scorched the lower body, then moved upward. If the executioner showed mercy, he might strangle the woman beforehand or use wet wood to produce more smoke and less pain. But mercy was not guaranteed. The woman's cries, if they came, were often drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the crackle of fire. Stoned to death under Babylonian law. Around 1754 BCE, during the reign of King Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest known legal codes in human history was inscribed in stone, the Code of Hammurabi. This Babylonian law code, discovered in Susa and now housed in the Louvre, outlines brutal and highly gendered punishments for moral crimes. Among them, adultery committed by a married woman was treated as a capital offence, punishable by death through public stoning or drowning. Law Section 129 of the Code states, "If the wife of a man is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. If the husband lets his wife live, then the king shall let his servant live." This passage underscores two core elements of Babylonian justice: the absolute control of the husband over his wife's body and fate, and the expectation that both the adulterous woman and her lover would face execution. However, unlike the man, who could sometimes be pardoned or replaced with fines, the woman's penalty was almost always fatal. While drowning was a prescribed punishment, stoning was widely used across Mesopotamian city-states, especially where the act of punishment needed to be more public and participatory. Archaeological evidence and legal commentary from neighboring cultures, such as the Assyrians, show that stoning adulterous women served as a communal act of moral purification. The condemned woman would be taken to the edge of the city or into a public square, stripped of her clothing and social status, and placed in a pit or tied to a post. Then men of the community, often including elders or the husband himself, would throw stones until she collapsed from injury or lost consciousness entirely. The punishment was deliberately designed to be slow, humiliating, and symbolic. Stones were chosen because they required sustained violence from multiple people, turning execution into a collective act of justice. The woman, once a member of the household and community, was now reduced to a criminal body destroyed by the very people who once protected her. For the Babylonian state, adultery by a woman wasn't merely betrayal, it was seen as cosmic disorder, and stoning her to death was considered a necessary act to restore social and divine balance. There was no trial by jury, no appeal. The stones sealed her fate. Public pillory and flogging in colonial America. In the 17th and 18th centuries, across the Puritan settlements of colonial America, adultery was not merely a moral sin, it was a public crime. Colonial law, particularly in Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut and Virginia, drew heavily from Old Testament scripture, treating female infidelity as a direct assault on divine and social order. Although execution for adultery was rare by the 1700s, public humiliation and corporal punishment became the preferred means of enforcing moral discipline. The most notorious of these were the pillory and the flogging post. Under the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, 1641, adultery was technically a capital crime. If any man shall commit adultery with a married or espoused wife, the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. In practice, most colonies eventually replaced death sentences with severe public whippings and long exposure in the pillory. Women, however, bore the brunt of these punishments. Courts were far more likely to prosecute them than their male counterparts, particularly if pregnancy exposed their crime. In towns like Boston, Salem, and Williamsburg, convicted women were dressed in plain garments, tied to a whipping post, and given 39 lashes across the upper back, often in the presence of neighbours, clergy, and even their husbands. Afterward, they were placed in the pillory, a wooden device that locked the head and hands in place, leaving the offender to stand for hours as passers-by hurled insults, filth, or stones. The punishment was designed not only to inflict pain, but to annihilate reputation, the ultimate social death in Puritan society. Women were sometimes forced to wear the letter A sewn into their garments, a real practice long before Nathaniel Hawthorne's fictional The Scarlet Letter, 1850. The branded letter marked them for years, ensuring that the shame of adultery could never be escaped. Colonial diarists like Samuel Sewall recorded such sentences matter-of-factly, noting that a woman was whipped for fornication in the presence of many, a grim reminder of how normalized these spectacles were. These punishments were as much about deterrence as retribution. The screams, the blood, the jeers, all were instruments of moral control. In colonial America, the woman's body became the canvas on which society wrote its laws of virtue, one lash at a time. Across centuries and civilizations, the female body became the battleground for moral control, scarred, silenced, and sacrificed to preserve patriarchal power. These punishments were not isolated acts of cruelty, but systemic tools used to uphold social hierarchies and religious codes by making brutal examples of women who defied them. Which of these punishments do you think